London, January 25, 1990. Ava Gardner, the woman MGM called the most beautiful animal alive, is dead. She is 67 years old. She is alone in a small flat in Kensington. Not a mansion, not a suite, a flat. The kind of address that surprises people when they learn it. Her housekeeper, Carmen, finds her. There is a chair by the window. She had been sitting in it for weeks, watching a street that didn't know her name anymore. The phone beside that chair almost never rang. Not for work. Not from old friends. The last calls that came were from a journalist she'd hired to help write her memoirs. A book she'd agreed to do. She said, because she either wrote the book or sold the jewels, the most famous face of the 20th century. An Academy Award nomination, a BAFTA nomination, over 60 films, $400,000 a picture at her peak, a chair by a window, no one knocking. Her last words to Carmen were three. I'm so tired. What makes a woman that tired? And why was no one there? This story deserves to be heard. Subscribe to Old Money Widows. Her name was Ava Lavinia Gardner, born December 24, 1922. Grabtown, North Carolina, a name so small it barely appears on maps. The youngest of 7 children. Her father, Jonas Gardner, grew tobacco and cotton on land that barely held the family together. When the farm failed, her mother, Molly, ran a boarding house. There were no books on the shelves except one Bible. Ava was not permitted to read a novel until she was 16. She was studying to be a secretary when her photograph changed everything. In the summer of 1939, she visited her sister Beatrice in New York. Her brother-in-law Larry Tarr, a photographer, put Ava's portrait in his shop window. A messenger connected to Lowe's, MGM's parent company, walked past. He stopped. He came back. He didn't get her number, but he noted the shop, and that notation traveled up a chain until it reached Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios in Culver City, California. MGM arranged a screen test. The veteran test director, Al Altman, reviewed the footage and saw something he couldn't fully name. Her biographer, Lee Server, would later describe what Altman saw as a flash of hypnotic fire, the moment when an 18-year-old girl from a North Carolina farm looked directly into the lens and looked like she belonged nowhere else on earth. The director supervising the test reportedly clapped his hands and announced, "She can't talk. She can't act. She's sensational." On July 22, 1941, Ava Gardner signed a standard 7-year contract with MGM. She was 18 years old. The salary was $50 a week. She arrived in Hollywood with Beatrice. The studio gave her a voice coach before she had unpacked. Her North Carolina drawl was, in MGM's clinical assessment, nearly incomprehensible to mainstream audiences. They gave her new vowels, new posture, new clothing, a new public face assembled from the ruins of the original one. They fixed everything they considered a liability and turned everything they considered an asset into a slogan. Their slogan for her was 4 words: the world's most beautiful animal. That phrase tells you everything you need to know about how MGM saw her. Not an actress, not a woman, an animal. Beautiful, yes, but the beauty of a thing that is owned. For 5 years, she appeared in small walk-on roles and publicity photographs, hundreds of photographs. Her face spread across pin-up cards and studio promotional materials. MGM was building a brand. She was 22, 23, 24 years old, and her face was already everywhere, and she was still learning how to act from scratch. In 1946, MGM loaned her to Universal Pictures for a film noir called The Killers, based on a Hemingway story. She played the femme fatale opposite Burt Lancaster. The camera found something in Ava Gardner it had not found in anyone else. Something wordless, unlearned, that hit the audience before they had time to decide what they were feeling. She became a star, not the kind MGM had planned, the kind the audience decided on themselves. The Hucksters, One Touch of Venus, Showboat, Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, Mogombo. By the early 1950s, she was one of the most recognizable women on Earth. Her name above the title guaranteed a box office. She earned $400, Suzozode, per picture. Mogambo earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress in 1953. She married 3 times before 30, Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, Frank Sinatra, and the press covered each marriage and divorce with a hunger that was not about her happiness. In 1950, filming Pandora on the Costa Brava in Spain, she discovered something she hadn't felt since childhood. She could walk into a village and be a person rather than a product. She danced flamenco in bars until 4 in the morning. She fell in love with a matador. She laughed without it being photographed. She sat in the sun without it meaning anything except the sun. She filed that feeling away carefully. The specific sensation of inhabiting a body that belonged only to herself. She had millions of witnesses, a world that watched her every move. Not one of them was watching the thing that mattered. You have to understand what MGM actually was in 1941. It was not a studio in the sense we use that word today, meaning a building where films are made. It was a closed system. It had its own doctors, its own lawyers, its own security personnel. It controlled what its contract players wore, where they travelled, who they were permitted to be photographed beside, and what they were allowed to say to journalists. The publicists it assigned to stars were not there to serve the star. They were there to manage the institution's investment. Louis B. Mayer ran it. He was not a man given to loud confrontations. The people who worked under him, who feared him, who owed their careers to his approval. They described his power as something quieter than anger, more durable than threats. He understood what people needed: security, recognition, the particular warmth of being told they mattered. He offered versions of all three. He attached conditions. Ava Gardner described the MGM atmosphere in her autobiography, Ava, My Story, published the year she died. She used 2 words: stifling and killing. She described the morality clauses embedded in her contract. Language empowering the studio to discipline or dismiss her if she did anything that might, by their judgment alone, degrade her in society, or bring her into public hatred, contempt, scorn, or ridicule. Read that clause carefully. It sounds like protection. It was the opposite. It was a legal instrument that gave one party, the studio, the power to define what was degrading, what was contemptible, what was scandalous. And because they defined it, they could manufacture it or suppress it at will. She was not permitted to leave Los Angeles, even on vacation, without written studio approval. In 1944, when she was 21 years old, she wrote to a friend in North Carolina that she wanted to come home to visit. The letter said, "But the studio won't let me just now. I'm hoping to go next fall, 21 years old. Permission required to go home." When she and Mickey Rooney decided to marry in 1942, both being MGM contract players, they needed Louis B. Mayer's personal approval. He gave it. He framed it as his blessing. That framing mattered. The particular cruelty of the system was the gratitude it manufactured. It conditioned people to feel fortunate for being permitted to exercise rights that were inherently theirs. When she appeared at a political rally for progressive candidates in the late 1940s, the studio moved immediately. Her politics were not hers to hold publicly. When she began her relationship with Frank Sinatra, still married to his first wife at the time, Mayer told her to stop. She didn't stop. The studio noted that. They noted everything. That was the true architecture of their control. Not a locked door, but a ledger full of what you had done, what you had said, what you believed, what you refused, all of it sitting quietly in a drawer. available to be opened whenever the institution decided you needed reminding of your position. Ava Gardner knew the ledger existed. She stopped checking whether it was growing. That is the thing that was never said about her while she was famous. The most effective containment doesn't require force. It requires only that the person inside the system begins to self-police on the institution's behalf. Over years, that self-policing becomes indistinguishable from character. People look at the woman who stays inside the lines and say, "She chose this." They don't ask what built the lines. She said in her autobiography that stardom gave her everything she didn't want. Everything she didn't want. She wanted to belong somewhere. She wanted to stop asking permission. She wanted a life that didn't require institutional approval to visit her own family. Instead, she got the most recognized face in the world and a ledger in a drawer in Culver City, getting thicker every year. The ledger was still growing when she walked into her third marriage. She married Frank Sinatra in November 1951, 72 hours after his divorce from Nancy Barbato was finalized. The press treated it as the conclusion of a years-long scandal. It was not a conclusion. It was the opening of a different kind of trouble. In the early 1950s, Sinatra's career was in serious decline. The film roles had stopped coming in the quality he expected. Recording contracts were uncertain. The voice that would eventually fill every room he ever entered had temporarily failed him, and the industry that had adored him had turned to find someone newer. Ava was the one working. Ava's name was the one selling tickets. The financial asymmetry between them, her stability, his freefall, corroded something in the foundation of the marriage before it had fully set. The fights were long, drinking through full nights, accusations without evidence, reconciliations that lasted until the next time. Friends she had known before Sinatra began the quiet calculation that proximity to both of them was no longer sustainable, and proximity to power would last longer than proximity to her. They didn't announce their departure. They simply became unavailable. That is how the emptying always works. Not a door slamming, calls that go unreturned, plans that don't get made. She was filming Mogambo in East Africa in 1953, in Nigeria, in what was then Kenya, when she discovered she was pregnant with Sinatra's child. She was deep in production on a John Ford film, thousands of miles from Los Angeles, and there was something growing inside her that MGM's contract had already decided, in its penalty clauses, was professionally incompatible with her continued employment. She wrote about this plainly in her autobiography. MGM had all sorts of penalty clauses about their stars having babies. If I had one, my salary would be cut off. So how could I make a living? Frank was absolutely broke. MGM made the travel arrangements to London. That detail sits uncomfortably in the historical record. The institution whose contract made the pregnancy economically impossible also arranged the logistics of ending it. The system produced the problem and the solution in the same breath and presented the solution as a service. She came back to the set in Africa. She stood in front of John Ford's cameras. She delivered the performance that would earn her the only Academy Award nomination of her career. Ford had tried to talk her out of it before she left. He told her, "Ava, you're married to a Catholic, and this is going to hurt Frank tremendously when he finds out." She did it anyway. She came back. She said her lines. No one on set asked how she was. She didn't try to tell them. Less than a year later, she became pregnant a second time. She did not consult Sinatra beforehand. In her autobiography, she described her thinking. "I think Frank, in his heart, knew what I was going to do, but it was my decision, not his." She described waking from the second procedure to find him sitting beside the bed, tears on his face. She wrote, "I think I was right. I still think I was right." She wrote that sentence as a woman who has been cross-examined by her own conscience for 40 years and has refused to change her answer. The next time someone calls Ava Gardner reckless, and people still do, remember that line. She was not reckless. She was calculating costs inside a situation where every option had a price, and she was the only one paying. The calculation was hers to make, inside a body that an institution had already assigned a commercial value to, inside a marriage that was fracturing, inside a contract that had never asked her permission about any of it, a body the contract had priced, a marriage already cracking at the weight of it, a woman making the only decision that kept her financially alive. She came back to the set. The cameras rolled. The room stayed quiet after those trips, both of them. No studio liaison checked in. No MGM representative reached out with anything other than the schedule. The system had been designed so that the personal cost of its requirements was simply invisible, not hidden, exactly, just unaccountable. There was no form for it, no column in any spreadsheet, no clause in any contract that said, "And here is what we understand this extraction will cost you, and here is how we intend to account for it." There was nothing. The trip happened. She came back. The work continued. She filed it away alongside the memory of what it had felt like in Tossa de Mar in 1950, dancing until 4 in the morning in a country that didn't own her. Two things the contract couldn't reach. She didn't ask for acknowledgement again. She had learned the precise shape of what was available from the people around her, and an honest conversation about what the trips to London had cost her was not inside that shape. What the contract extracted. From 1941 to 1958, 17 years. From age 18 to 35, MGM collected on every transaction Ava Gardner's name made possible. When they loaned her to Universal for The Killers, the film that transformed her from a contract player into a genuine star, the loan-out premium and the career value that transaction generated flowed to MGM. She received her weekly contract rate. The gap between those two numbers was not disclosed to her. Contract players rarely saw those figures. That opacity was a feature of the system, not a flaw in it. An informed actor might have asked for different terms. She wrote in her autobiography that the studio capitalized on her beauty while paying her a fraction of what they earned in her name. She said she resented, for the entire duration of her time there, the men who held power over her income, her schedule, her image, and her body. She was not wrong to resent them. She had the numbers. She was just never shown them. When her MGM contract finally expired in 1958, she was 35 years old. She had spent 17 years building a commercial empire that belonged entirely to someone else. She left as a freelance actress, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what the studio had taken. The industry moved on. So did she, because there was no other option available. What the press manufactured. She was married 3 times before she was 30. The press wrote about this as though it revealed something essentially defective in her character. An inability to be held, a restlessness that was coded in the language of 1950s journalism as a particular kind of female failing. Consider the comparison. Mickey Rooney married 8 times. He was beloved, an American original. R.T. Shaw married 8 times. He was considered a serious intellectual. Frank Sinatra married 4 times. He was a national institution. Ava Gardner married 3 times and was assigned a word. Not printed here, but you know the one. A word that existed only to describe women who moved through men, without being sufficiently disciplined by the experience. MGM's publicity department did not correct those narratives. Why would they? Those narratives kept her name in print. They kept audiences curious. The product was more interesting, with a little scandal attached. She said in her autobiography that she was shy. that she relied on alcohol to feel comfortable at the parties she was required to attend, in the rooms she was required to enter, performing the version of herself the studio had designed for public consumption. No gossip column ran that version. The woman the world called dangerous was, in private, a North Carolina girl who never stopped feeling out of place in those rooms. The reputation they built on top of her made every silence around her life easier to maintain. A difficult woman's complaints are expected. They require no investigation. What was taken in silence? This is the part that appears in no official document. Because no official document was designed to hold it, she had 2 pregnancies. Both ended in London. Both were followed by a return to work. The studio travel records exist. The emotional accounting does not, because the system had no form for it. In 1968, she made the decision to have a hysterectomy. She was 45 years old, living in London, and concerned about uterine cancer. The disease that had killed her mother Molly in 1943, when Ava was 20 and had only just arrived in Hollywood, still learning her new vowels. She made that decision alone, quietly. In the city she had chosen specifically because it was far enough from MGM's reach. She never had children. She had said to friends, in various forms, across various decades, that she wanted what her parents had, the kind of belonging that comes from a home you build with people who are yours, not people assigned to you by a studio or a marriage or a contract. A place where the phone rings because someone is thinking of you, not because they need something from the product. The children she might have had, the version of herself who might have existed in a world where the contract had no pregnancy clause, the woman who might have sat in a house in North Carolina with a life she had built herself on her own terms, in her own time. Those people were never born, not because she didn't want them, because the math said otherwise, and the mathan was written by other people. The penalty clauses had met the instability of the marriages, had met the financial mathematics of survival. Twice, at the exact moments when that other life might have become possible. 3 forces, aligned, none of them asking her permission, none of them required to. No one sat with her afterward and asked what it cost. That was not an oversight. The system did not have a mechanism for that conversation. It had mechanisms for scheduling, for publicity, for morality enforcement, for loan-out arrangements. It did not have a mechanism for, what did we take from you, and what do we owe you for it? No one asked. Not then, not after, not ever, while she was alive to answer. What the industry did when she aged. By the mid-1960s, the roles had changed in quality. The parts that came were not the parts she had earned. On the set of The Bible, in 1966, she had a relationship with co-star Georgie C. Scott. That, according to her own account in the autobiography, turned violent when he drank heavily. She described it in specific terms: a man smashing bottles to create weapons. The press received that revelation when the autobiography appeared in 1990 as a vivid anecdote in a colourful life, not as what it was, a woman describing physical endangerment on a professional set, with no institutional recourse available to her because no such recourse existed. She took whatever roles came. She said her later work was, in her own words, strictly for the loot. She didn't soften it. She had stopped softening things. The system that had made a fortune from her face discarded her image the moment the market moved on. That is not cruelty. That is indifference operating at scale. Indifference at scale is its own kind of destruction. It requires no malice and leaves no fingerprints, and is nearly impossible to name while it is happening to you. She was not silent by choice. That has to be said plainly, because the quiet around her life was so complete, for so long, that it is easy to mistake it for her own preference. It was not. She tried, repeatedly. in different registers through different doors. Every time, the system had a mechanism for absorbing what she said and returning it to her in a different shape, a shape that served the story the institution needed told. In the late 1940s, she gave interviews in which she described the MGM contract in direct terms. She called the atmosphere stifling, killing, she said. We were told what to do, when to do it, and how, and we were paid very little. She named the morality clauses. She described writing home in 1944 to say she couldn't visit without permission. The press printed it. Then they processed it. Her protest became part of her mythology. She was wild, she was difficult, she was too much for any room to hold. Those qualities, which were actually a woman describing the terms of her captivity, were relabeled as personality traits and resold as the product. The thing she was saying became the thing they were selling. There is a particular form of silencing that works by giving the person a microphone and then changing the frequency so no one hears the actual signal. That was the first time. In 1986, after the strokes, she agreed to work with a journalist named Peter Evans on her autobiography. She was 63 years old, partially paralyzed, living in London. She told Evans she was doing the book because she either wrote it or sold the jewels. That sentence should be read carefully. The most valuable woman in Hollywood at her peak, a woman whose face had generated tens of millions of dollars, wasn't in her 60s doing a book deal to stay financially viable. In those sessions with Evans, she was more direct than she had ever been publicly. She named the penalty clauses. She described the two pregnancies and what followed. She talked about what it meant to have a contract assign a financial consequence to your body's capacity to carry a child. She talked about coming back to the set. Evans later described those sessions as something between a conversation and a reckoning, a woman finally reaching for the full version of a story she had been telling in pieces for 40 years, trying to get it all into the room before the room closed. She pulled back, repeatedly. There were truths she approached and retreated from. The full version, the version she would have written if she were 20 years younger, or if the people responsible for the damage were no longer alive to sue her, or if she hadn't spent so long learning that saying the full thing cost you more than it cost them, that version did not make it into the published text. And this is what silence actually feels like from the inside of it. It does not feel like silence. It feels like pragmatism, like protecting what little remains, like the earned knowledge that speaking fully will not change what happened, will only strip away the last few things you've managed to keep. She was 63, partially stretched, financially stretched, working on a book deal. Those are not abstract conditions, they are conditions. Ava, my story was published in 1990, the year she died. She did not see it on the shelves. She was never placed in front of a camera by someone who asked, "What did the contract take from you?" Not once in the entire duration of her career. She was asked about her beauty, her marriages, her reputation, her wildness. She answered. She was specific and funny and honest in the way people are when they've accepted that no one is listening for the right thing. There is one line in the autobiography that carries more weight than anything around it. After the second procedure, after waking to Sinatra's tears, she wrote, "I think I was right. I still think I was right." That is not the line of someone at peace. That is the line of someone who has been arguing with a verdict for 4 decades and still will not concede. The verdict was never formally issued. It didn't need to be. The silence around what had happened was the verdict. She came as close as anyone had ever allowed her to get. Then she died before she could finish saying it. In 1986, Ava Gardner suffered 2 strokes. She was 63. The strokes left her partially paralyzed down her left side. She could walk with a cane when her body permitted it. Her housekeeper, Carmen, was there. Carmen was usually there. That was the shape of the days. The career that had begun in 1941, when a photograph in a New York shop window caught the attention of the wrong kind of man in the right kind of position, ended not with a tribute or a ceremony or a final film with her name above the title. It ended with a body that could no longer perform on demand in a flat in a city she had chosen 30 years earlier because it was far from the one that had made her famous. Frank Sinatra called after the stroke. He wanted her to come to Los Angeles to see a specialist he had arranged. He reportedly organized a medically staffed private jet. She was too ill to travel. The trip never happened. He sent yellow roses to her funeral, her favorites. The card read, "All my love, Francis." He did not come. In those final years, she worked on the memoir with Peter Evans, trying to get it told, running out of time. Her final words to Carmen, according to those present, were, "I'm so tired, not frightened, not angry, not asking for anything. Tired." Sit with that word. Not the ordinary tiredness of age and illness, though she had both. The specific exhaustion of a woman who had been explaining herself, defending her choices, navigating her body's ownership by an institution, outliving 3 marriages, losing 2 pregnancies, watching her name generate a fortune she received a fraction of, seeing her protests repackaged as mythology for 50 years. That is a category of tired that has no common name because it happens too quietly and too slowly for anyone to identify it while it's occurring. Now return to where we began, London, January 25, 1990. A flat in Kensington. A chair by the window where she had been sitting for weeks. The phone that rarely rang. The chair was empty of visitors, not because she was unloved. Sinatra had loved her in the only way he knew how, which was at a distance, with flowers. Others had too, in the ways available to them. But the people who might have filled that chair, the children, the penalty clauses had made mathematically impossible the woman she might have become in the parallel life, where the system didn't own the terms. Those people were never born. The studio had made a calculation in 1941 in a standard contract at $50 a week, and that calculation had compound interest. It gathered through every renewal, every loan out, every morality clause, every trip to London, every return to the set, until the accumulated cost of a decision made when she was 18 years old reached forward all the way to a January morning 67 years. Later, she died alone. Bronchial pneumonia. Her body was flown home to Smithfield, North Carolina, near where she was born, and buried beside her parents. Jonas, who grew tobacco on land that barely held them. Molly, who ran the boarding house when the farm gave out. Who had one Bible on the shelf and loved their youngest daughter, the way poor people love their children, which is without contracts and without conditions. The woman MGM had called the most beautiful animal alive was returned to the ground 2 miles from the road she had left when she was 18 years old. No ceremony the industry attended. No tribute from the studio that had owned her name for 17 years. A gravestone, her name, the dates, the world's most beautiful animal, returned to the ground. The phone did not ring that morning. Nothing. No one came. The autobiography came out in 1990. The same year she died, the same year she could no longer be asked to explain it or defend it or reframe it for a journalist who needed something usable. It was reviewed, discussed briefly, then absorbed into the noise of obituary and retrospective. The revelations. 2 abortions, MGM's penalty clauses, George C. Scott's violence on a film set were noted and catalogued as items in an extraordinary life, processed by a press that had spent 40 years building the legend and had no different register available for the woman underneath it. Then, slowly, something shifted. Historians began looking at the studio system not as a factory for American dreams, but as a mechanism of institutional control over the bodies and choices of the women who made it profitable. The pregnancy penalty clauses, not only in Ava Gardner's contract, but in the contracts of Judy Garland, Jean Harlow, Bette Davis, and others, began to be discussed as what they demonstrably were: documented instruments through which studio executives dictated the reproductive decisions of the women under their financial authority. Vanity Fair published a piece naming the practice directly. Biographers came. Lee Server wrote his biography of Gardner. Charles Hyam had written one earlier. They worked from the documents, the contracts, the studio memos, the correspondence, the autobiography. They built the record that the system had spent decades making unnecessary to keep. The American Film Institute ranked Ava Gardner number 25 on its list of greatest female screen legends in 1999, 9 years after she died. A number on a list, the particular species of recognition that arrives only after the person it honors has stopped being in a position to need it. In Tossa de Mar, the coastal town in Spain where she had filmed Pandora and The Flying Dutchman in 1950, the first place she had told people she felt genuinely free. They erected a statue of her in 1998. It shows her as Pandora, the woman who opened the box, the woman who could not be returned to the container once she had been let out. The people of that small town understood something that Louis B. Mayer's institution never did. The thing worth preserving about Ava Gardner was not what MGM manufactured. It was what she protected from MGM. The laughter in a Spanish bar at 4 a.m. The face looking directly into the lens without calculation. The stubbornness that the studio marketed as wildness. And that was, in fact, something much simpler: a refusal to believe that a signed piece of paper could own the whole of a person. The Ava Gardner Museum is open in Smithfield, North Carolina, near the tobacco fields. Near the road she left when she was 18 and dreamed of returning to on her own terms, once the studio permitted it, which it never quite did. It is still open, and in that museum, in those biographies, in the slowly accumulating historical record of what the studio system extracted from the women who made it, something is being said that was not said while she was alive, that she was not difficult. She was navigating impossible choices inside an impossible system and making the only decisions available to her. That she terminated 2 pregnancies, not because she didn't want children, but because a contract signed when she was 18 made pregnancy financially catastrophic, and a marriage that was already fracturing couldn't absorb what staying might have cost. That she came back to the set, both times, and said her lines, and no one asked, that she tried to speak, and the mechanism turned every word into merchandise, that she wrote, "In the last book she would ever see published, I still think I was right," and meant it as a verdict on the system, not an apology to it. She was a girl from a farm in North Carolina. She signed a contract at 18 for $50 a week. She became the most recognized face on Earth, and then she became someone the Earth stopped recognizing, and then she died in a flat in London with a chair by the window and a housekeeper who found her. The contract ran 17 years. The silence ran longer, but here is what the silence could not do. It could not erase the record. The autobiography exists. The studio memos exist. The penalty clause language exists in documented form. The biographies are careful and sourced. The history is there for anyone who is willing to look at it without flinching. Not at the legend, not at the beauty, not at the marriages, but at the mechanics, at what was done, and by whom, and in what language, and what it cost a woman who was never given an honest accounting of the bill. She never stopped being the girl from the farm, even when the world knew her face. That stubbornness, the refusal to believe that a signed document could own the whole of a person, was the thing that kept her intact when the system tried to reduce her to an asset. It was also the thing the system called her greatest flaw. She was not a flaw. She was a woman asking to be treated as one. Her name was Ava Lavinia Gardner. Ava Gardner.